This week for my national park tour, I thought I'd take a minute to talk about a rather recognizable bird, the oyster catcher. This black and white bird with a brilliant orange beak is so named because it has the ability to both stab into partly open oysters and use a hammering technique to break open oysters and clams to eat the meaty goodness inside. However, more than one oyster catcher has been caught back. Bad aim, bad luck, or an especially strong, cranky oyster has caused some oyster catchers to get drowned as they are held down by the bill in an oyster that's getting some back. So between the two, it seems at least a bit like a fair fight. Anyway, this picturesque bird lives along the Atlantic coast from Boston to the Gulf Coast of Mexico, though non-breeding birds have been found wandering about as far away as Argentina and even Chile. Now, some of the birds are non-migratory, that is, no matter the season, they stay put in their home, but others are clearly leading a more peripatetic life. And several parks in the middle of the American oyster catcher's range in North Carolina are trying to figure out the mysteries of this multi-habited bird. The Cape Lookout National Seashore is working with other locations to ban and track the birds and come up with plans to protect nesting and fledging habitats, as the practice of driving vehicles on beaches has spread. Because oyster catchers are so visible and something of a local apex predator, they are a good indicator species of the overall health of a beach area. If the area is not overly disturbed by human presence and the shellfish population is healthy, oyster catchers will hang out there. And everyone will tell you it is much easier to count oyster catcher birds than mollusks that hang out under the sand. So go ahead and take a walk out on a national park that includes a sandy Atlantic beach, and not just in hopes of catching a breeze. Keep your eyes peeled in Massachusetts or New York or Maryland or Delaware or Virginia or the Carolinas and Georgia and even Florida. And look out for this flashy bird, letting you know that the oysters are doing okay. Episode 123. Oysters on ice. An amazingly important piece in building American food. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the ways the oyster rose through 19th century America and what was going to lead to the intensive mining of the American oyster beds. And I will introduce you to the Oyster King of New York, who will show us how to rise in America through food. To hear about all of this, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that oyster liquor, the liquid that is inside the oyster shell with the oyster body, is frankly some kind of magic. Okay, maybe not magic, but it is a biochemical wonder. As I've been researching the early 19th century oyster and its further travels, I kept reading things that seemed impossible or at least unwise for seafood. But modern industry reports of studies on oyster survival under various storage conditions showed me that for oysters, more things are possible than I ever imagined. And it explained to me why some surprising oyster feats worked out the way they did. And that bivalves, as critters that have figured out how to survive being left high and dry at least twice a day, are more amazing than I ever imagined. A quick thing about me. As a tiny child, I wanted to grow up and be a marine biologist. I got a bit sidetracked, but still retain a deep fascination with all things briny, plant, animal, combination, and in between. And if you really want to distract me, just start asking me questions about the workings of a coral reef food web. Anyway, where were we? Oysters surviving out of water. Right. So the tidal zone is an amazing place. It is inhabited by plants and animals that have figured out how to go from being underwater or being lapped or pummeled by waves to being high and dry and then doing it all over again. And wait, there's more. They don't just need to figure out how to deal with water and no water, they also have to figure out how to deal with wild temperature swings. On the coast of Virginia, for example, when the water retreats, an oyster might have to deal with 90 Fahrenheit or 30 C air, or 20 Fahrenheit or -8 C air, depending on the season. These critters have to be ready for anything and with no extra equipment. And one of the critters that is especially hardy, besides barnacles, some of those seem to be able to live on just sea spray, are oysters. Way back in episode 49, my first oyster episode, I spoke about Roman oligarchs flexing their wealth and power by ordering up British oysters and having them packed in snow in a barrel and brought to their villa somewhere else in the Roman Empire. At the time, I assumed this was galloping horses rushing to get a couple of pipkins of oysters over the Alps. Boy, was I wrong. The month-long or longer trip from Britannia across the Channel, through Gaul, over the Alps, and then down somewhere in the boot of Italy could have proceeded at a reasonable and realistic wagon pace, especially if there's a chance to replenish the snow during a couple of mountain crossings. If you're anything like me, living in our modern cold chain-driven foodosphere, this seems impossible. But what these industry studies were testing was just how long an oyster can continue to live out of water. And the results? Well, for market-sized oysters, at air and water temperatures around 35 Fahrenheit or 2 Celsius, these mollusks camped out in their tightly clamped shut pair of valves, or shells to us non-molluskologists. The answer to how long is 3 months, with up to an 80% survival rate. And for very large oysters, the ones now called boots or booters, it can be up to 6 months. It turns out, confirmed by science, tasting, testing, and checking for evidence of active oyster circulatory systems, an oyster sealed up, airtight in its shell, bathed in its own oyster liquor, if kept down at hibernation temperatures, is fine for up to 3 months or longer. I was flabbergasted. But for the people who had lived without refrigeration for, well, always, they had clearly made this observation. The oyster pies and stuffings and stews as part of a cold weather menu now makes all kinds of sense. A barrel of oysters harvested in chilly weather and packed in seaweed and maybe some ice, sitting out on a cold porch or in a cold shed or down in a cold cellar, would just keep alive and waiting in stasis. So when stagecoaches and then trains started to move about the country, why not load them up with barrels of oysters in cold winter weather? Why not ship oysters to Ohio or Illinois or Colorado or even Santa Fe, New Mexico, packed in barrels with seaweed and ice on the new railroad? Because the oysters apparently did not care. And with the burgeoning ice trade I talked about last time, fall oysters, if there was extra ice, and spring oysters with fairly new ice could also be packed and shipped inland as well. So now oysters in their shells, despite this absurd out-of-water longevity, are still fragile, and if they have to be shipped in shell with packing material and possibly ice, it does make them bulky and heavy and an expensive item to ship. And let's face it, anything that needs to stay cold, not just cool, unless it's the dead of winter, it's still a risk. So really, a fresh oyster delivered somewhere like a Syracuse, New York salt baron's dining room was still a luxury. And in all my reading about American food, it is clear that while an oyster can be a luxury, they are most definitely an everybody food. Not quite as cheap as potatoes, but far more accessible than beef or even fowl. So how was everybody else who was not getting deliveries of ice-packed barrels of fresh oysters, how are they getting their oysters? Turns out there's 2 answers for this quandary. First is a little boring, but important all the same. If you live near the waterfront, and in this day and age, most Americans did live at most a day or so on horseback away from a seaport of some kind, you just got them off the boat. Or you went and even plucked them up yourself, especially in the early part of the century. Until then, there were just a lot of oysters still paving the eastern shore of the new America. From Maine to the Carolinas, if the shore and currents were right, and all over the Chesapeake Bay the conditions were very right, the oysters were just lying there. And in the winter, when farm work was more or less shut down, that was the perfect time to go and collect a mess of oysters. Last episode I spoke about how ice harvest worked out because farm workers were relatively idle. And in the winter, you could just keep them cold and eat them as needed. And when it wasn't so cold or the oysters did need to travel a bit, well, they could be pickled. Now, it was the oyster pickling recipes where I started to become suspicious that there was more to oyster liquor than I had previously considered. After all, I had read reams on pickling vegetables, and they needed plenty of salt or plenty of vinegar or both. The careful partial dehydration of the vegetables and their partial cooking was an essential part of the process. Much was made of making sure the vinegar wasn't too weak. And when it came to pickling or salting fish and meat, cod, pork, and beef particularly, drawing off water and ensuring complete contact with adequate salt was the most rigorously written about portions of the operation. In all the recipes, getting enough salt was much of the challenge. The 18th century challenge of getting good enough salt, quality salt, had been somewhat alleviated by the growing American salt industries. But getting the salt and applying it to the meat properly was everything. And in the end, whether fish, flesh, or vegetable, when it came to pickling, you needed lots and lots and lots of salt. And when it came to the English and American style of vegetable pickling, plenty of vinegar. Strong vinegar was required as well. But oyster pickling recipes were different. When it came to pickling vegetable matter, cucumbers or melons or lemons or asparagus or peaches or what have you, the selection of the item mattered. No bruises, no holes, and the handling of the items was always fairly gentle, both to keep the items in attractive shapes and so the strong vinegar and salt solutions wouldn't penetrate too far in, altering the texture and erasing the flavor entirely. What the makers of these preserves knew, but hadn't sorted out scientifically, is that the agents of rot had to be kept out. The pickle solution kept the surface sound, and the wholesomeness of the fruits themselves ensured that they contained no agents of rot. As for fish and meat, again, it was necessary to draw out the vital fluids from the fish and the meat that allowed rot to flourish. And then the surface of the cod or the beef or the pork had to be well and truly salted, offering no place for agents of rot to land, gain a foothold, and get in. The salt and saltpeter pickle with meat was just like the vinegar and salt pickle with plants. Keep the agents of rot out. Now, what those agents of rot might have been was not of much concern. All that really mattered were the tools to keep those mysterious food wasters at bay. But oysters, with their unusual longevity away from the water, they were unlike just about everything else that started to degrade quite rapidly once away from their point of origin. While every other pickling recipe makes much of drawing off and draining away the fluids that come with the food, in oysters, keeping the liquid they arrive with was an important part of the pickling. Every single oyster pickling, bottle, and canning recipe I have found begins with instructions to shuck or shell the oysters, but to preserve the liquid or liquor they come with, and strain it for use in the preservation of the oysters. From there, the instructions vary, but for the most part, some salt and some vinegar was added, and it was also typical to add mace, along with some black peppercorns, some mustard seed, maybe some cloves, and allspice as well when they were billed as spiced oysters. Depending on the recipe, the oysters could be cooked in the pickling liquid, or the boiling liquid could be poured over the raw oysters. But generally, when it came to pickling oysters, gentle cooking until plump and just done was the order of the day. And the common wisdom on their consumption was that these spiced or pickled oysters were best after having had time to bathe in the liquid for 3 or 4 days. Such pickled oysters were put in both glass and pottery jars. In both cases, straight sides were favored for tight packing, along with a wide mouth to assist with putting in and removing the oysters gently to keep them whole and sound. Sealed tight and kept cool, these pickled oysters would keep good for a few weeks to months, even being a popular food for sea captains to take on board to augment the extremely poor shipboard fare. And if one was even further away and possibly in a position of not having a cool cellar at hand, the last resort, canning, could be turned to. Though in this case the oysters were cooked as thoroughly as any other canned victuals were cooked at this point. And most likely canned oysters were destined to be stewed or chopped into stuffing for other meats, or combined with stale bread and possibly an egg to create meatballs or dumplings to go into soups, or to accompany and stretch out other meats sliced at the table. At the start of the century, with canning in its earliest days and mainly a plaything of the rich, it was the local cold, live oysters in barrels and pickled jarred oysters that were pantry food for most people away from the coastal cities. But in the cities, especially the port cities, oysters were nigh inescapable. The 19th century is the age of the oyster saloon, the oyster tavern, the oyster parlor, oyster house, oyster lunchroom, oyster counter, and of course, the infamous New York oyster cellar, and that's cellar as in basement. In the first part of the 1800s, oysters still carpeted large swaths of the Atlantic shore and were more or less accessible to all, even if you didn't have a boat, which made oystering a low-entry industry that many people turned to as a way to scrape by, make a living, and for a few, it became a way to make a bit of a fortune. So just as in last episode where we met the Ice King, here is where we get to encounter the Oyster King of New York, one Thomas George Downing. And Downing is one of those very helpful characters that's handy for telling the story of America because he keeps showing up and doing interesting enough things to be recorded in records that are findable. Born on Chincoteague Island off the Atlantic shore of Virginia, he was set up perfectly to grow up with the new America. His parents had been freed from slavery at some point prior to 1793, after the man who owned them had been convinced by a traveling Methodist preacher of the evils of owning people. And because he comes from a different background of most of the famous figures in the American story, he is able to add a particular viewpoint that's missing from most of my cookbooks and history books. But possibly even more important, he's on that leading edge of the food production and education wave that comes out of the enslaved class of people who were cooks in the houses of people who had purchased them. Because let's face it, if there's one thing we've learned in America, for the most part, food is seen as fuel. Something that needs to be produced as fast as possible in as large quantities as possible, hopefully for a great profit, which is to be consumed in large quantities, all in the name of making stuff and going places. Reading through cookbooks and pamphlets, especially the titles and comments sections contained within, it seems as if many Americans don't see the food itself as the point. Food, like other mechanical and scientific wonders that were swirling around in the 19th century, had a job. Except for a few oddballs, rich wastrels, and dandies putting on European airs, food is generally not something the American savors, enjoys, or writes about and considers the origin of. For most people, and in this case mostly women, cooking itself is not an occupation. Instead, it is one part of a panoply of jobs required to keep a house going. And America, with its Puritan roots and desire to be plain-talking, independent, and fast-moving, a period of the day dedicated to savoring and enjoying something, much less hiring and paying a person to be in charge of making fancy things to be enjoyed, is, especially in the 19th century, truly un-American. Except in one place: the kitchens of large landowners who have purchased and enslaved large numbers of people. The enslaved people who work in kitchens are the exception to this American thinking of seeing food as a cog in the machinery. To many an enslaved cook, food is literally life. If they can become the best and create food that is irresistible, then they can change their life for the better and maybe even the lives of their family. As a result, they become concerned with the sources of food and the techniques needed to prepare the food. And as the tides changed, and these same people were able to achieve a free state to reclaim themselves, they had knowledge of and the care for food that was valuable. And frankly, the low bar of American taste meant that there was an empty niche that needed filling, which, let's face it, is an approach to business most Americans can't help but admire. So, Thomas G. Downing, born on the Outer Banks of Virginia, was surrounded by the still plentiful Atlantic seafood and learned how to harvest and cook it. His parents, after being freed, had become caretakers of a meeting house or church on the island. There they also hosted meals and gatherings of prominent white families that visited the island to vacation and escape the summer heat of the cities. Already Downing saw the power that good food and hospitality had for making a better life. As you might imagine, the Atlantic coast during the War of 1812 was busy and rather a dangerous place that was unfriendly to business. What with the British and Americans stalking each other and occasionally shooting. Blockades made bringing the catch into the mainland something of a problem and really cut into the tourist industry. So it was during this time that Downing decamped and moved into the growing free black society developing in Philadelphia. We know this because he was kind enough to get married to his wife, Rebecca West, at a church where they were recorded members. But Philadelphia, despite being on a river, was not a great town for seafood, especially the clams and oysters Downing had grown up working with. For Philadelphia has a section known as Fishtown, and it's near the portion of the Delaware River that became a center for food distribution in the city, but it's far enough inland from the salt water of the Atlantic that being an oysterman was a lot of trouble. After all, in those days of largely human and wind-powered travel, it was a fair piece from Delaware Bay. By 1819, Downing had moved to New York, and there he worked as an oysterman, but clearly was putting his pennies by, for there are records of him leasing a building and opening an oyster cellar on 5 Broad Street in 1825. This was on the eve of New York State transforming from a slaveholding state to a free state. The legislature had voted in 1817 that the state would become entirely free on July 4th, 1827, and amazingly enough, they actually followed through with it, thus making Downing's plans sensible. He also took advantage of the growing newspaper business in the city, advertising the quality of fare to be found at his oyster house. Soon he was also advertising the delivery of barrels and jars of his superior oysters to, quote, all parts of the city, Brooklyn, and Jersey City. And after all, once you're delivering across the river to New Jersey, why not the world? Which is exactly what happened. Bills of sale recording overland and overseas sales have been found, as have pottery jars with Downing's stamps upon them. He was a man running a successful oyster counter and a successful oyster distribution business, fresh and pickled. And this was happening smack in the middle of the contemporary business district, and Downing was part of the 19th century oyster as a fast food craze. Unlike now, when most of us American employees are relegated to sad desk sandwich or sad desk salad, there was a time when we actually stopped work and stepped away from the instruments of our toil for a time and ate lunch while just eating, and probably talking with other workers. I mean, even farmers and field hands stopped for midday dinner in a farm kitchen. Even during the busiest harvest time, they had hand pies and beer or cider brought to them. And of a certainty, at this time, some of those pies would have been oyster and something pies. Oysters and leftover fowl, oysters and forcemeat, oysters and chopped ham. And city business people left their desks in buildings that didn't contain electricity or plumbing. They would go out to a restaurant or other establishments that served food for midday dinner. Lunch to us. I'll explain the origin of lunch and why that was a very 19th century thing indeed in a later episode. Anyway, as nice as it was to pause in labors for a bit to refuel for the remainder of the day's toil, few people were interested in pausing for a multi-course meal. This was still America, after all, young as it was, so a relatively speedy meal was still the order of the day, and the oyster made for an excellent speedy meal. In New York or Charleston, South Carolina, or London or Boston or Mystic, Connecticut, or anywhere there was a thriving business community and oyster beds nearby, there was a roaring trade in the midday oyster meal. Served raw or pan-fried or broiled in the shell over a fire until they gapped open, oysters were now served with a squeeze of lemon or a splash of vinegar and a dash of pepper, and some were even served with this new vinegar-based hot sauce coming up out of the South and up from the Caribbean. And it was common to wash down the midday oysters with a porter or a stout or a cider. The oyster loaf was also a popular dish of the day. It would be made with pan-fried or pickled oyster meatballs and was basically a precursor of the modern oyster po' boy sandwich. It could be a stripped-down version that could be taken in hand by a busy dock worker, or it could be dressed up, baked, and topped and served as part of a larger meal served at table. So running an oyster cellar in the midst of a busy business district was a great way to make money if you were good at it. It required getting the oysters early in the morning in the bushel baskets that oystermen would bring up to the quays. It required you to have a good relationship with the people who consistently picked the best oysters from the best spots. You needed to keep good beer and cider on hand, which meant being aware of the best brewers and keeping them on your good side by paying them promptly. You also needed a plentiful supply of firewood cut correctly for the day's tasks. After all, you needed to roast and fry the oysters as customers desired them. The need for good tools to open the raw oysters, as well as plates and tankards and such for serving, were also necessary, as well as a crew to empty the place of shells and wood ash at the end of the day. But Downing wasn't satisfied with just being an excellent oyster cellar owner. For at this point, the early 19th century, restaurants were a new thing. Up until then, people ate at home or brought hand pies and loaves and hard-boiled eggs and bits of cheese with them, or they might stop in a tavern or a saloon for a drink and whatever stew might be on, which is why Oyster Saloon would stand out. But all of these places were nearly exclusively male establishments. Women might work at them as servers and sculleries, but they were never customers. After all, at this point in history, women working or wandering far enough from home to need to eat out in a public establishment in the middle of the day was more or less unthinkable. Eating anywhere but a private home, as a resident or an employee, was such an odd notion as to be unimaginable. But this is America, and we're always breaking the rules, especially with the rise of these post-1812 new money types. Machinery, salt, cloth, trains, and such were making all sorts of uncultured people rich. And they didn't want to stay at home. They were used to being out in the world. Oh yeah, and they were also being snubbed by an awful lot of the people who used to hold all the power. And so Downing, as with a few other people, he took advantage of the situation and expanded his oyster house to include one of New York and America's first public restaurants where women could be brought even at night. It had carpets and chandeliers, damask curtains, tablecloths, and fine china. It stood up alongside the emerging Delmonico's as a place to go out and be seen at. And the menu for such an establishment obviously expanded beyond just the oyster. It included turtle soup, fish, and of course many things stuffed with or served alongside a long list of oyster preparations. The connections Downing formed as the proprietor of one of the first 13 fashionable restaurants of New York meant that he was known by and popular among prominent foreigners as well. Downing ended up catering for one of Charles Dickens' later visits, when he was famous and welcomed among the city's wealthy elite. Downing also made the most of the burgeoning global steamship business and started sending his oysters to the Caribbean, to France, and even to the table of Queen Victoria. England had been ahead of the Americans in stripping out their oyster wealth, and so were importing them from their former colony. The oysters arriving in London were of such a fine quality, Downing was awarded a gold chronometer. and he was able to amass enough wealth that he sent one of his sons to Paris to be educated in the rapidly advancing culinary arts. Paris was an obvious destination as A, they were leading the Eurosphere in culinary development, but also B, Paris had a lively, mixed-raced Creole community where Black Americans would fit right in, be welcomed, and not be outsiders. Downing was part of that cadre of Black American food entrepreneurs who would shape the tastes of the country, but in the ensuing century he would be more or less erased from the record. While Downing's erasure from the record was due to societal forces trying to pretend America was just a white country, the oyster would spread throughout the country. Just as Americans had mined the soil and the timber of the new country, having no thought for how it got so rich and plentiful in the first place, the oysters of America were in the process of being mined as well. When the colonists had arrived on American shores, access to said shore in some places was blocked by shoals and banks and piles of oysters, which Americans readily ate. But for a long time, there was a limit on just how much eating could be done. Only so many people can live around so many oysters. But with the advent of canning, of railroads, and steamships, suddenly there were many more people that could get access to those oysters. And then when mass canning rather than rich people canning gets underway, the oysters are going to start flying out of the water. The building of the cities and the growth of the oyster industry are, in fact, going to go hand in hand. For one of the important materials for building a 19th century city is mortar, that stuff that goes in between the bricks and stone blocks. It holds things in place and distributes weight. And in the early 19th century, most mortars were lime mortars. Lime itself is a mixture of calcium oxides and hydroxides, which can be purified from burned oyster shells. And as the 19th century is the time of American cities along the coast converting from wood cities to brick cities, the rivers of emptied oyster shells stinking up the streets and yards around oyster establishments. And when oyster canning plants are becoming an essential ingredient of the growing American food industry, these shells will become important in helping to build cities. You know, it's funny. I went into this whole project with beef and sugar and iron and caffeine as the essentials to American food. But getting into the 19th century is showing me that if I took a snapshot at different times, the winners of who or what ran the world would be different. And here in the 19th century, especially at the start, it's the oyster that America is being built upon. It's helping establish the lunch counterculture. It's helping create a fine dining scene in New York and the country. And it's creating a class of widely available, relatively shelf-stable food that requires very little work to make table ready. Compared to fish or fowl or salt pork, a pickled oyster or a canned oyster takes almost no effort at all to make it ready for addition to a pie, or to make it into stuffing or a meatball, or even to be simply dressed in seasoned vinegar and taken to the table as is. Sure, we may be coming up on our hot dog days and soon the hamburger, but it truly seems America's very first fast food was the oyster, and we are going to literally eat them all up. As America starts to become an oyster nation, our relationship with finfish is going to keep changing. Ice, trains, canning, the rise of the restaurant, and boats with engines is going to change who eats fish and how, in ways we as a nation are still living with. I mean, can you imagine going to a fish market and choosing from 63 kinds of fish? I certainly can't. But you could in New York in 1796, and you still can in places that aren't America. So next episode, I will take you through some of the changes in the early 19th century that seem to hold the keys to how we became a nation that can barely name 10 fish. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. They let people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or that you at least find it interesting. I'm also still doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength, in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. As always, there's still some food, but now it comes with fashion and fighting and fraud. We finished up the Shogun miniseries over there and are now messing around in the Cowboy West with Bass Reeves. And after that, we're going to spend some time looking at the Legend of Zorro. So come on over and join us there. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta and elsewhere as @THOA Food. And all this basic information is available in the show description.